tremendously is giving us a review on Amazon. We're slowly growing those reviews, and it helps get the word out. As you all know, this is a topic that the world desperately needs. And so anything we can do to get the word out is fantastic, and we appreciate the reviews so far. Let me share with you, before we dig into the content today, Leader Factor's mission. Our mission is to influence the world for good at scale. This is something that we're very passionate about, which is why you see us on these webinars, developing the content, pushing it out, and having you share it with your friends and colleagues. It's something that is so desperately needed in today's world, and we encourage you to share this content. And we want to acknowledge the common thread among all of us today. We care about people. That's something that we notice during these webinars, our trainings and certifications. It's such a fantastic audience to engage with because we care about people. So thank you for caring about people. So let me go ahead and introduce Tim. Tim, for many of you, probably needs no introduction. Tim is the CEO and founder of Leader Factor. He's an Oxford-trained social scientist who's been doing instrument design and research in this category for several decades. And we're ecstatic that he's able to carve out some time to make these webinars with us and have these conversations. So we want to take advantage of his time and insight and experience. And so if you have questions throughout this webinar, go ahead and put them in the chat. We've got our team members moderating chat in Zoom, in Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. And so we're trying to get all of that synthesized and put into these webinars as fast as possible live while we're doing this. And so go ahead and do that. Tim, anything you want to say?
I'm just happy to be here, and I'm ready to jump in.
Oh, I love it. Let's get going.
Okay, let's get going. So we're going to talk about how to fix a toxic culture. And this is an important, and it's a thorny issue. It's a tough issue. It's one of the most difficult problems that you may face at some point in your professional life. We all deal with it, I think, in some way or another. But so this is the agenda. We have six kind of steps that we're going to walk through. But before we do, I want to back up and I want to talk about what a toxic culture is. So here is what we call a culture continuum. And it runs at one end, as you can see, from a healthy, productive culture to the other end, to an unhealthy, destructive culture. So that's the continuum. Now, toxic means that we're going to the far end of that unhealthy, destructive end of the continuum. We're way over there. Toxic means there's infighting, there's drama, there's abuse, there's immoral and illegal behavior. Now, most organizations are dysfunctional. It's only a matter of degree, right? We know that. Toxic is something different. Toxic means that you have moved to the far end of the spectrum, and now it's become destructive. And in some cases, it puts the viability of the organization in jeopardy. It's really that serious. That's what toxic means. And then, of course, it's creating a destructive influence to individuals. So that just gives us some context to understand that toxic is way over there at the destructive end. Okay, so we're going to ask you some questions about this so that we can kind of baseline you and this global audience that we have today. So here's the first polling question that we want to ask you. And Junior, you can pull this down. Have you ever worked in a toxic culture? Based on this definition that it's become destructive to human beings and may even put the very viability of the organization at risk. So
you should see that on your screen, everybody. We've got about 60% voted so far. Really interesting results coming in on this one. Very interesting. And I'll close this out in about 10 seconds and share the results with you. But these polls are very interesting. So what do you guys think? What's your best guess? If you had to guess 0 to 100, what percent of people have worked in a toxic environment?
Yeah, before we show you the results, what do you think they're going to be?
You guys are pretty much right on the money here.
Wow.
This is really interesting, which goes to show just how pervasive this can be. So I will end the poll. Let me share the results with you. Okay, we have 87% that said yes. And understand that through all the mediums, we have thousands of people on this webinar. So this isn't a very small sample. This is statistically significant. And so it's very interesting to see this result.
87%.
87.
Yeah, pretty incredible. So this is not a rare, we wish it were a rare experience. We wish this were something that happened very seldom, but unfortunately it's something that we've all probably been a part of at least once in our lives, unfortunately. And we have to deal with it. We have to figure out how we can deal with it better.
Yeah.
Okay. So 87% of you have personal experience with a toxic culture. Let's go to the next question. Now, the second question, using a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 represents a very healthy and productive culture. So that's the healthy and productive end. And 1 represents a very unhealthy and destructive culture. How would you rate the culture of your current team or environment? So where are you today? Let's get a baseline for where you are today. Go ahead and answer that question.
I think we got the language mixed up, Tim.
Yeah.
On the polling question on the screen and the polling question here.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to have to take this one with a grain of salt.
Okay.
But the distribution itself is interesting, right? So hopefully you're reading the poll as it reads in the poll itself, and we'll share these results with you. But just know that we'll need to take these ones with a grain of salt.
So for the polling question, 1 is very healthy, and 10 is unhealthy. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this one out. I won't share the results of this one because obviously we've got people that are responding to both questions and it may not be clear. But what I can say, well, let me just go ahead and share them and I'll just talk you through this because it's interesting to see that regardless of whether or not you answered the polling question in the slide or the polling question in the poll itself, we have a distribution that's interesting, right? And a lot of people that are saying that we are not healthy, right?
Yeah, it's a broad distribution, which helps us understand that we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that in mind, we know that we have a lot of work to do, and most of us have dealt with a toxic culture at one point or another. So let's go to the steps. Here's step 1. Step 1 is find the toxic source. Now, there are 2 questions that you're going to need to ask as you're thinking about how you can fix a toxic culture. The first question is the boss actively toxic or passively complicit? Now, we're going to explain what that means. That's a very important question. The second question that you will want to answer is, do you have a first generation or multi-generational toxic culture? Now, why does that matter? We're going to talk about why that matters so much if you're trying to fix it. Actually, the answer to that question is very important. All right. So let's go to the first issue or the first question, and let's talk about the distinction between an actively toxic boss and a passively complicit boss. Actively toxic bosses actively participate in toxic behaviors. They themselves are engaging in toxic behaviors. So here's what happens. After an abusive episode, an actively toxic boss tends to focus on image, his or her image, and impression management, and rarely demonstrates a willingness to change their toxic behaviors. This is what the research shows. Actively toxic bosses rarely show or feel remorse. They're not sorry. They're not sad about it. And they're not taking personal responsibility for their behavior. That is the prevailing pattern among actively toxic bosses. Now, here's the other group. Passively complicit bosses allow abusive episodes to happen. They allow abusive episodes and cycles of mistreatment to happen on their teams. They are enablers. They permit it. They will sometimes acknowledge their enabling behavior and work to change it. Do you see the difference? So the research says the actively toxic boss rarely is going to change. The passively complicit boss is often coachable. So that distinction is very important as you're assessing the nature of a toxic environment.
And a couple things here. Terry says, I like that you use the term boss and not leader for this. That's a nice catch, Terry. We're a little bit deliberate about that.
Yeah.
And for those in the chat that are wondering, all of this is being recorded. So you'll have access to the slide visuals, recording of the chat in some cases. And so this will all be made available to you shortly after the live session.
Yeah. Okay, so here's a question that is very important. And this is, so we're going to pull this polling question down. Please answer this question only if you have had an actively toxic boss.
Go ahead and put this one in the chat.
Okay. Right. So did your actively toxic boss change and become an effective non-toxic boss? Can you guess what the research says? Almost never. There's a 5% chance or less that an actively toxic boss is going to change his or her behavior. Okay. Now here's the second question that we need to answer. Are you dealing with a first generation or a multi-generational toxic culture? Let me give you the definitions of each of these. A first generation toxic culture is one that is created by the modeling behavior of the leaders in which a toxic culture did not previously exist. So they are the ones that created it. The leaders that you have today are the ones that created it through their modeling behavior and the norms that they have been reinforcing. This is first generation. Now, on the other hand, a multi-generational toxic culture is one that is created by the modeling behavior of leaders in which a toxic culture did previously exist, and the current leaders adopted and perpetuated the patterns of toxic behavior. So you have inherited the toxic culture. It could be second generation, it could be third generation, it could be 10th generation, but it's perpetuated by the next leaders and the next leaders and the next leaders. They perpetuate it, they adopt the norms, the toxic norms, and then they continue to do that. Now, let me ask you this question. Go to the chat for this. Why does it matter if you're in a first generation toxic environment or a multi-generational toxic environment? Who cares about that? Why do you think that matters? What do you think?
More embedded, more pervasive.
Yeah.
The multi-generational is more difficult to change.
Exactly.
The willingness to change can be different.
Yeah.
The role models are often brought up in that culture.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Easier to impact first gen.
It's very, very difficult to change a multi-generational culture because it's entrenched. It's calcified. It is fossilized, right? When in the study of organizational culture, we talk about fossilization. If it's a multi-generational toxic culture, chances are you're dealing with fossilized behavioral norms. What's it going to take to uproot those, to dislodge those? It's going to be more difficult often because they've been around for so long and they've been perpetuated.
Joshua says in Sweden, we say it's in the walls. That's cool.
Oh, really? That's interesting. It's in the
like
walls.
That.
Great metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, so step 2, remove or coach. This is basically a synthesis of all the research. If you have an actively toxic boss, that boss must be removed. There's not a workaround because you have a 5% chance or less that boss will take responsibility for his or her behavior and change it. So we have to remove the toxic boss. If there's a passively complicit boss, we try to coach that person. There's a possibility, there's a much greater possibility, I should say, that person is coachable. Now, let's talk about what coachability means. Here is an assessment and a diagnostic tool that we use to assess coachability. Now, take a look at this. This 2x2 matrix helps us understand that coachability is a function of willingness and self-awareness. It's those two things coming together. So if you're in the upper right quadrant and you have high willingness and high self-awareness, you're accelerating in your personal development. And that's where you want to be. If you're top left, your willingness is high, but your self-awareness is low. So you're progressing, but you're not going as fast as you could. If you're in the lower right, you're limping. That means your self-awareness is high, but your willingness is low. So you're moving slowly and maybe begrudgingly, maybe resentfully. You're aware of yourself. You're aware of what needs to happen and what needs to change, but you don't really want to very much. And then in that lower left quadrant, you are either failing or plateauing because your willingness and your self-awareness are both low. Right? So that's a diagnostic tool that you can use for yourself and for those of you who may be leading teams or parts of organizations. You can use it as a diagnostic tool for your team members to plot them on the tool.
Tim, do you see any patterns here in your work with executives? Do you usually see that it's a willingness problem, or is it usually a self-awareness problem? Any insight from your experience?
I thought, that's really an interesting question. Early on in my career, I thought, well, most executives are highly self-aware, and it's just a matter of pushing forward, and they're highly willing. It's actually not true. We work with all kinds of executives who are what we would call low self-monitors. They really lack in self-awareness. They have not been able to crack themselves open very well and really conduct a searching self-inventory. They really haven't done that. And so we give them exercises to help them do that. They think they're self-aware, but they have all kinds of blind spots, and they don't realize that they're not nearly as self-aware as they thought.
I think an interesting point here, we've got a couple people mentioning this in the chat, that it would be an interesting assessment or at least exercise when evaluating potential promotion. And this is something that's very interesting when we talk about multi-generational toxic cultures. If we're not evaluating these types of criteria as promotion criteria, then we can work ourselves into a difficult position. And we get between a rock and a hard place because we've started to put people in higher positions in the organization that have not demonstrated a capacity or pattern of behaving in a coachable way, right? Yeah. So I think that's pretty interesting.
So let's do a summary so far. Here's a summary so far. A toxic culture means individuals are exhibiting toxic behaviors. That's pretty obvious. To fix a toxic culture, those individuals must stop exhibiting toxic behaviors. So those are two premises. A toxic culture is always a reflection of leadership. Now, you got to think about that. It's always a reflection of leadership. Leaders are either actively toxic or passively complicit, meaning that they are allowing others to be toxic. Actively toxic leaders should likely be removed because there's a low chance that they're going to change. Passively complicit leaders often can be coached. And then the last point is first-generation toxic cultures can be changed more easily than multi-generational toxic cultures because those norms have not been calcified as deeply.
We've got a couple questions. One from Joshua, can a leader be neither? I think that's an interesting question. And yes, these are the two dominant categories when it comes to toxic culture and why it happens. But you could have a leader, for example, that is so distant, that is so far removed from what's going on that they're absentee and they're not even tuned in to what's going on in the organization. So I think that sort of distance can create a situation like that. So there are some combinations of different variables that, may result in them not falling into a particular category, but these are the dominant patterns that we see.
Well, I do think those that are passively complicit would include the absentee landlords and those who are aloof. Right? Those who are aloof and they just don't know what's going on. Those are choices. Those are choices to be like that. Okay, step 3, communicate psychological safety as a human right. Now, what is psychological safety? Psychological safety is an environment of rewarded vulnerability. That's what it means. An environment of rewarded vulnerability. How does it work? For those of you who are not familiar with the 4 stages of psychological safety progresses through 4 stages. So first of all, psychological safety is a function of respect and permission. And teams and organizations, they progress through 4 stages. So the first stage is inclusion safety. Inclusion safety means that you feel included, accepted, and that you have a sense of belonging. That's your foundation for a healthy culture. That's your foundation for an inclusive, creating a deeply inclusive environment. If you don't put that in place as your foundation, you can't advance to the next stages, the higher stages. But if you do, then we progress to stage 2. Stage 2 is learner safety. Learner safety means you can engage in the learning process without fear that you're going to be embarrassed or marginalized or punished in some way. What does that mean? You can ask questions, you can give and receive feedback, you can experiment, you can even make mistakes. That's learner safety. And it's vitally important that we have learner safety in all social units. Then we move to stage 3, which is contributor safety. Contributor safety means that you take what you have learned and you apply it to make a difference, to contribute, to participate in the value creation process. Now, can you see the natural sequence? You have to be included first, then you learn, then you contribute based on what you have learned. Now comes the 4th stage, which is the culminating stage. We call this challenger safety. Challenger safety means that you feel free and able and safe to challenge the status quo without retaliation or retribution, without jeopardizing your personal standing or reputation. So what you can see is that as we progress through the 4 stages, what's happening? Well, 2 things are happening. First, you're following the natural sequence of human needs. Second, you are climbing a ladder of vulnerability. And so by the time you get to stage 4, you're at the highest rung on that ladder of vulnerability. Your level of personal exposure and risk is very, very high. This is what we're trying to create on teams and in organizations. So think about what a toxic culture does to the level of psychological safety. So it just takes it down, it destroys it, it brings it back down to the ground, and then you have to rebuild. Junior, any comments on that at all?
I'm wondering if you want to throw this last poll out.
Okay, yeah, let's
about
throw the last
overall
poll
risk.
out.
I think this would be an interesting one to put in here. So this next poll is going to have 4 questions. So make sure you answer all 4. And I'll go ahead and launch this. So using a 10-point scale where 1 is low and 10 is high, what degree of overall personal risk do you associate with feeling included on the team? That is the first question. Then, what level of risk do you associate with feeling safe to learn on a team? And from there, contribute and then challenge. So go ahead and fill these out, all 4 questions. I think this one's going to be interesting. And it's part of how we discovered and created the 4 stages model. Looks like we've got, it's climbing. It's climbing. Go ahead and get your votes in there. What are your guesses? What do you think the pattern will be? If you can't submit your vote, make sure you've answered all 4. Lower to high, higher to low, low to high, low to high. Okay. I'll give you about 10 more seconds. So I know we need to move on. A hockey stick, says Joshua. Okay, here we go. Let's go ahead and end this. I'm sorry for those of you who are still in the middle of it. Okay, we're sharing. So you can see how this goes. Is pretty interesting. We've got relatively low risk in inclusion. It starts to get a little bit higher. And then you can see 25% in question 4 say that the personal risk of challenging the status quo is a 10. Tim, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I was just looking at that same statistic. That's amazing.
It is, huh?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So this, you can see that this is confirming this universal pattern that as we move from inclusion to learning to contributing to challenging, there's more personal risk associated with doing those 4 things. And then think about that in the context of the culture, right? The culture is either going to empower you to do these 4 things or it's going to shut you down. And that's why we care so much about trying to fix toxic cultures when we encounter them. Okay, so let's summarize. The way to summarize this is this way. Psychological safety we consider a human right. It's not something that you earn. It's something that is owed to you. It is it's a human right. You're entitled to it. Based on what? Based on your humanity. So you just have to bring 2 things to the table. Be human and don't present others with harm. That's it. If you can bring those 2 things, then I am morally obligated to provide you psychological safety. I'm morally obligated to not only include you, but treat you with respect and allow you the permission and the ability to contribute. Okay, now let's go a step further though. The next step is more about how. So how do you do that? How do you remove the toxic culture, and then how do you create an environment where that doesn't come back? Well, you apply a worth test, not a worthiness test. In creating a healthy, constructive, wonderful culture, we apply a principle that says worth precedes worthiness. What does that mean? That means that I'm going to include you and you're going to include me based on the inherent worth that we have as human beings. We're not going to apply a worthiness test. We're not going to apply criteria that would say you're not worthy of inclusion, because that's actually not true. So applying those kinds of criteria, that would be wrong, and it would be immoral to do that. Let me give you an example. Early in my career, I worked in manufacturing. I actually worked in the steel industry, and I had a boss that was toxic. He was a command and control, large and in charge, fear and intimidation boss. You know what I'm talking about? Ever had a boss like that? Not a lot of fun. And so I was on the receiving end of this fear and intimidation. He had normalized fear as a management tool, which many managers and many leaders have done since the Industrial Revolution. They think it's a legitimate management tool. And so it's what we call the normalization of deviation. They think it's fine, right? They were deeply socialized that way. That's how this gentleman was. So I was on the receiving end of that. Well, how did he think? Why did he think he could treat me that way, with such disrespect and such destructive behavior? What was going on in his head? This is what we have to ask ourselves. How can you justify that? Here's how he justified it. He took one or more of these factors, and he was able to justify himself, tell himself a soothing story about his prerogative to treat me this way. Now, in this case, which factors did he choose? And these are the factors that people often choose. So take a look. So he chose his position. He thought, I'm the plant manager, I'm the big boss, and therefore I have the prerogative and the right to treat you with disrespect. So he invoked his position as what we call a junk theory of superiority. Does that make sense? He invoked his position. Now, I want you to think about how we do this and how this leads to toxic cultures. We often make a claim for superiority based on one or a combination of these factors. And then what does that do? It creates divides, it creates divisions, and then that leads to toxic behavior. And then people somehow get this idea that they are justified in their toxic behavior. Do we not do this with race? Where do racial tensions come from? Right? Do we not do this with education? I have more education than you. Do we not do this with gender? I belong to a superior gender. Do we not do this with ethnicity? How about age discrimination? Think about that. So these are all factors that we use on a very routine basis to make claims of superiority and justify destructive and then even toxic behavior.
Have you all had worthiness tests against you? Have people used these against you? A lot of yeses.
Yeah.
It's interesting because we can choose one or more of these probably in many, many instances throughout our lives. And these are more common than we perhaps would like to believe. They happen every day, all throughout organizations. And to the original point about toxicity lying on a spectrum, the same is true here. These junk theories of superiority can be perpetuated mildly or very overtly. And sometimes, so one of the ones that I really like here, performance, right? We may not think off the bat that that's a junk theory of superiority, but it can very quickly turn into one where I perform at a higher level than you. Therefore, you are not worthy of my inclusion.
Yeah.
Right. I think that that is so interesting. Familial, physical, political. I love this slide. This is one of my favorites. Yeah.
So unless we're applying a worth test and not a worthiness test, we will never be able to generate or create a culture of deep inclusion. Right? We'll never be able to get there because inclusion safety stage 1 says we're not trying to remove the differences between and among us. We're not trying to remove those differences. We are trying to acknowledge and appreciate and respect those differences. And if there is a performance gap, for example, which Junior just mentioned, okay, great, then I'm going to try to help you, but it doesn't give me any justification for exclusionary behavior, right?
Yeah. Chris put tenure or length of service in the chat. Yeah. That's one we should add. I like that one.
Yeah, that's so true. So I have more seniority than you, therefore I'm justified in my exclusionary behavior. So here's a way to summarize. Humans tend to govern themselves based on junk theories of superiority. Think about your own team, think about your own organization. How do you create that foundation of psychological safety and inclusion if you are applying worthiness tests? You cannot get there. It has to be a worth test to establish our foundation. Let's go to the next step. The next step is model and patrol the boundaries of respect. This is how we maintain a healthy culture, a culture where people can thrive and do their best work. Now let's provide a conceptual tool to help us here. This is what we call the spectrum of influence. Now I want you to think about this. On one end of that spectrum is manipulation. Manipulation is a way that people often try to influence each other. Manipulation is based on the principle of deceit. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum of influence. Coercion is on that other end, that other pole. Coercion means what? It means we're trying to muscle people. It's based on the principle of force. We're going to muscle them into doing what we want them to do. So on the one end, we have our tricks, manipulation, all the tricks that we might want to use. On the other end, we have our power tools. Many people, many leaders are socialized and they are taught to use these ends of the spectrum of influence. Let me reach for manipulation. Let me reach for coercion. And what they don't understand is they're not leading anymore. They have abdicated leadership in the true sense of the word. So what's in the middle? What's in the middle of the spectrum? Persuasion. Persuasion includes all of the legitimate tools of influence. So I have a question for you. Let's talk about this for a minute and go to the chat. What are the legitimate tools of influence under the heading of persuasion? What are we talking about? What would you use? If you're not going to reach for the tools of manipulation and you're not going to reach for the tools of coercion, what do I have?
Chrissy says discourse. Catherine, facts. Lauren, enrollment. Jason, inspiration. Joshua, sharing stories. Joy, education. Josh, invitation. Kobe, education. Honest conversations, discussion, inclusion, involvement, awareness, respect. Lori, information. Roger, dialogue. These are fantastic, everyone. Michelle, legit educating. David, enthusiasm. Andrew, data. Elizabeth, transparency.
Yep.
Facts, respect. Encouragement. Understand the other's needs first. Man, your comments are a course alone. Thank you, everyone.
That's what's in the middle.
That's what's in the middle.
What's in the middle, guys. You nailed it. And so what do we do? And it doesn't matter if you have title, position, or authority. It doesn't matter if you're the CEO or if you're the last person hired. It doesn't matter if you're a manager or an independent contributor. We have an obligation to develop the tools of persuasion, because whether we have title, position, or authority or not, we will be trying to influence other people. And so we need to go to school on these. We need to come to mastery in the middle and not reach to the left or the right, because then we're abdicating legitimate influence.
Tim, do you think that this spectrum of influence and these behaviors that we're talking about apply to individual contributors?
Absolutely, 100%. And I just want to say, so Susie just said, starts with listening. Yes. Persuasion starts with listening. And then from listening, it usually, the natural progression is, it then goes to questioning. The best leaders that we work with, they lead through questions. It's an inquiry-based mode of leadership. They lead more through questions than answers. They have let go of the old imperial model of leadership in which they believed falsely that they thought they had to have all the answers. They were the repository of all the answers. That's the antique, that's the old model, the imperial model of leadership that said you needed to know everything. Can you imagine trying to lead that way in the 2020s in a dynamic, unforgiving, hyper-competitive environment? How can you lead that way? You can't lead that way. You've got to lead, and that's the sequence. Start with listening, then go to questioning, and then use all of those other tools that you guys have mentioned, those legitimate forms of influence. Fantastic. Now, let me introduce or share with you a corollary principle. And I mentioned this in the book, and I give some case studies. Fear is if I go into an organization or a team and there's fear, that's the first sign of weak leadership. Now you got to think about that for a minute. It is the first sign. It is symptomatic of weak leadership. We know, we don't need to know anything else about the leaders, but we know that the leaders are struggling because they are using fear as a proxy, as a substitute for leadership. They're using it as a substitute. So think about that. Fear is the first sign of weak leadership. We see that over and over again.
One of the things I want to call out here, Tim, is if fear is the first sign of weak leadership, it's very easy for us to enter an organization, or maybe we're a part of a culture of which fear's a part, and point and say, he's fear inducing. This is where the fear is coming from. But it's always important to reflect and ask ourselves if we're contributing to any of that fear, because we often do. And as we talk about, this is not always overt and aggressive behavior. These can be subtle things, right? These can be very subtle things. We had some interesting conversations with a few of our clients recently just about workload, right? And how we can induce fear through these expectations that are gargantuan and perhaps unrealistic. A lot of things that we can do that are subtle that help in a terrible way perpetuate some of that fear. And so it's important that we take inventory and think about our own behavior after an interaction in a meeting or at the end of the week. What did we do to decrease or increase the level of fear in our teams and organizations?
That's right. Now, let's take it a step further, just so we complete the logic. What does fear do? Fear changes people's behavior. Fear triggers the self-censoring instinct, right? Fear activates the pain centers of the brain. Fear thrusts you into a defensive mode of performance. The implications of fear are profound. Can you do your best work when you're plagued with fear? No, you can't. Right? A fear-stricken team is not a team that's going to be doing their best work. So the implications are so important to us. And I love what you said, Junior. How are you affecting and influencing and contributing to that?
Tim, how did it affect you when you were in that situation in steel?
Yeah.
And you were in that culture?
You self-censor.
And you felt yourself doing that?
Yeah, you self-censor. You know that the risk of retaliation and retribution is real. And so you go into a mode, you withdraw, you recoil, you retreat, you go into a mode of personal self-management, self-preservation and risk management, which is a perfectly logical thing to do for an adaptable creature, right? We're trying to survive. We have to survive first before we can think about thriving. So if the psychological safety is not there, if I'm in a toxic environment, then I'm going to adjust appropriately and I'm going to manage personal risk. Right? So that's what we do.
Well, everyone is feeling that. I think we've seen that in the chat, that people have experienced this more often than not.
Yeah. What do we want to do? We want to have a boss like the boss that I had. So after that, I worked for a Japanese parent company, and my boss was in Tokyo. And I thought at first, oh, this is going to be interesting. I don't think this was new for me. And I wondered, can I challenge? Can I really give my opinion? Can I make suggestions? My boss was incredible. He gave me a license to disagree. He gave me a license to challenge. And man, I went beyond surviving to thriving. It was a completely different experience because he created the enabling conditions where we could do that. And that's the realm of innovation, isn't it?
And he was a few thousand miles away, right?
He was.
Which is interesting in today's environment. So this doesn't necessarily have to happen face to face, right?
That's true. Yeah, we only got together maybe a couple times a year, maybe 3 times a year, and that was it. Other than that, it was a virtual environment and a virtual relationship, and we proved that it can work.
Yeah,
it can work. Okay, here's the last step: incorporate psychological safety as a promotion requirement for management. Now, Junior, you talked a little bit about this before. Here's a summary statement. Employees who do not have a demonstrated track record of creating psychological safety should not be eligible for promotion to management or higher levels of management. Now, that's a pretty bold statement. Think about what we do. What do we do? Most of the time, we promote people into management based on the strength of their performance as individual contributors. We take the best engineer and say, we're going to make you the manager. We take the best accountant. We take the best salesperson and we say, we're going to make you the team leader, don't we?
Yeah, all the time.
All the time. That's a universal pattern. And what we're saying is, Yes, continue to pay attention to that individual's performance as an individual contributor. Is that an important factor? Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've got to include an additional factor. And that factor is, does this person have a track record of being able to create psychological safety for others? And we can tell, people can tell, people know, that's not a mystery, right? We work with this person. Does this person generate psychological safety or not? That has to be incorporated as an additional selection criterion for promotion and management, or promotion to a higher level of management, right?
Yeah. What happens if we don't do this? It's so interesting. I think it's so top of mind just because of the conversations we've been having, but we have an opportunity to work with a lot of organizations. Some of the largest, most complex organizations that there are across industries, healthcare, government, higher ed, technology. And this is the same everywhere. It's a universal principle and a universal failure pattern that we see in sales-driven organizations, which are many. We see this all the time. And it gets perpetuated because if someone sells 20% more, well, we may as well promote them, right? If they're a standard deviation above the average, then they're automatically going to make an excellent leader, right? That's how it works. And no, we see this all the time. And so this is a key piece that we can't overstate. This is also a way that you can work from the bottom up. It's interesting, the difference. If we have the option, top down from an executive team is our preferred method of transformation. But this, what we're talking about right now, is a way that we can transform the organization from the bottom up, right? We can start promoting at the lowest levels of the organization based on some of these criteria, and that will filter up. And what we talk about a lot, not specifically in this webinar, but doing that will generate confirming evidence. Because if we have a sales team and we promote a people leader who is incredible at creating high levels of psychological safety, at rewarding vulnerability, at doing all of those things in the persuasion category that all of you talked about, that person will generate a higher performing team on average and over the long term than anyone else, right? And that will go noticed. That will not be hidden from the organization. And so I like this point a lot.
And if you're not convinced, let's just go back and talk about what leadership is all about. Leadership is about scaling influence and impact. And when you move from an individual contributor role to a management role, the nature of your contribution shifts in a fundamental way. You go from direct contribution to indirect contribution. You have to go through a psychological transition in order to be able to contribute indirectly through others, and love doing that. Find deep satisfaction in that. Rejoice in the success of your people. Some people don't do that well. They shouldn't be in a management role. And I don't apologize for saying that pretty matter-of-factly. They really should not be managing other people. They should be individual contributors, and that's fine.
If you're on LinkedIn and you agree with that last statement, give it a like. Give this give the stream a like if you agree with that.
I know that's a little bold, but let's think about what managers are supposed to do. They are force multipliers. We should be agnostic to title, position, and authority. It's about their ability to influence using the central part, the centerpiece, the center part of that spectrum of influence. That's what it's all about. They're there to create psychological safety so other people can thrive. If they have no track record of doing that, and by the way, one of the questions in the chat was, well, how do you measure that? What are the metrics to know if someone creates psychological safety? Well, it's a qualitative assessment. All you have to do is ask the people that work with them. It's not a mystery, right? Do they generate psychological safety, or do they destroy psychological safety? It's a pretty easy assessment. It's not very hard. Okay. All right. Let's wrap up. So, Junior, any concluding words or comments based on your observations or comments that are coming in right now?
I think that a lot of what's coming in right now is about servant leadership. There's this air of humility that people are talking about. And so we're getting some good comments about that, pulling ego out of leadership, a lot of really good stuff. So, Tim, is it okay if I take just a couple minutes and tell everyone what we've got going on?
Yeah, let's do it.
And just a few of the resources that we have available for all of you. Once again, we appreciate your time. Tim, go ahead and go to the next slide. Yes, we want to talk a little bit about the giveaway. You'll be receiving, anyone that's listening to this, if you've registered for the webinar, which you have because you're here, you'll be receiving an email about 10 minutes after the end of this webinar with some giveaway instructions. We're going to be giving away some AirPods, copies of the book, in exchange for a few different things, liking the post, tagging some friends. All of the instructions will be in that email. So don't go ahead and do it just yet. There's a specific link to the post that we would like you to go to. But on leaderfactor.com, we have the certification. I think Freddie will be putting that in the chat. Ben will probably be putting it in the LinkedIn chat. If you would like to become certified in the 4 stages of psychological safety, we just opened a new date. I think we've got 2 March dates and 1 or 2 April dates. You'll have to check me on that. But that is an incredible way to bring this conversation and this content into your organization or your clients. If you're a third-party consultant, we work with a lot of third-party consultants that like to use this content in their coaching and in the initiatives that they roll out with their clients. And so that is something we have available to you. The last thing I want to mention that is perhaps the most important, and Freddie will be putting a link in the chat to this, is the 4 stages online training. We've teased this just a little bit in a few of our engagements, but we are happy to announce that we have completed all of the production for the course, and it will be launching in Q2 of this year. This is an online asynchronous video-based solution that will go through the entire 4 stages model. What is psychological safety? A deep dive in inclusion and learner, contributor, and challenger, along with behavior selection and action planning and reminders that can come to you through email and text message. So Freddie, go ahead and please put that link in the chat. I think I see it there. You can join the waiting list. That is the reason that I'm talking about this. To stay informed when this launches, we are putting the finishing touches on this course. It can be rolled out at any organization in any context. You can do it as an individual. You can bring it into your team. You can roll it out through an organization. But a very, very neat resource that our team has been working tirelessly to put together. The demand in this category is only growing. It's a category that is here. It is here to stay, and we are so proud to be a part of it. So please follow us on LinkedIn. Keep tabs on us, what we're doing. We do these webinars every few weeks. We've got another one coming up about DEI that is going to be fantastic. We're already putting that content together. So we are trying to put a lot of content out into the world regarding psychological safety. We all need it. It is truly the path to inclusion and innovation. So Tim, I think I've said probably too much. Anything that you want to say to close this out?
One parting thought for everyone. I want you to recognize that we are all architects of culture. You are a cultural architect, regardless of your role, because you radiate influence to your colleagues, and there's no off switch. You can't stop radiating influence. You are modeling and you are reinforcing certain behavioral norms. The only question is, what norms are they? So I want you to, this is my parting thought for you. You either lead the way or get in the way. You cannot be a neutral party. You cannot be a neutral actor. And I hope that resonates with you, and I hope that you reflect and think about that. And we want to thank you so very much for joining us and spending an hour with us today. We hope it's been worth your while. And thank you for caring about people. Thank you for caring about humanity. That's why we're here. And we look forward to the next webinar, and I'll see you soon.
And we will be sending out the recording to this entire session So if you want to binge watch it 10 times over the weekend, you're welcome to do that. Go ahead and share it with those that you think might be interested. And with that, we'll sign off. So I'll go ahead and stop the webinar, turn the cameras off, and we'll let the stream close out on the other channel. But thank you everyone so much for spending your valuable time with us. We appreciate you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks a lot.